Imagine an ordinary morning in a cafe where calmness and that aroma of freshly ground coffee create a familiar atmosphere. But what if something happens today that changes this place forever? Today's story will send you a barista, full of stereotypes and prejudice, pours coffee on an elderly black woman without even realizing she is the new owner of the establishment. Can you feel that tension? Can you imagine how that woman feels? Write in the comments what your name is and where you're watching this video from. Each of you is incredibly important to us. It is thanks to you that our channel is growing and resonating. We read all your comments and appreciate you being with us because your support is invaluable to us. Every single like, every single word you say is what drives us forward and allows us to tell these important stories. You are the heart of our channel, and we never stop thanking you for that. Enjoy the show. The sun was just beginning to break through the windows of the popular coffee shop, brightening the soft light inside and reflecting on the freshly polished tables. The tart aroma of coffee and fresh pastries wafted through the air like a familiar morning promise of warmth and comfort for guests. But behind the counter, where the employees were preparing to begin their workday, there was a special tension, hidden under the mask of the usual bustle. The barista named Alex, a tall young man with sharp features, stood at the coffee machine, glancing glumly at the door. He wasn't happy with the way the last couple weeks had seen the influx of customers become much more varied. To him, it was causing an underlying dislike and irritation he didn't even try to hide from his coworkers. The eyes of the staff intercepted his mood. One of them averted his eyes, sensing Alex's angry pushing of the coffee machine buttons. The other, hiding a smile, supported his sarcastic comments about the strange visitors and strange types that had been frequenting the place in recent weeks. They thought it was harmless chatter, but there was something more lurking in Alex's eyes, like a tense readiness for another confrontation that was making him more and more irritated. The atmosphere was gradually heating up, as if inside this county coffee shop, hidden from the street noise, something dark and hidden was waiting to happen. The door jingled softly, letting in an elderly black woman with warm, slightly tired eyes. She stopped on the threshold, looking at the county interior with a slight smile, as if remembering something pleasant. She wore an old-fashioned coat and a neatly tied shawl, and her movements gave off a poise and dignity that caught the eye. But the staff met her with wary glances. Alex, noticing the new visitor out of the corner of his eye, instantly tensed up, barely restraining a grin. He muttered under his nose, but so that his colleague nearby could hear. What are they doing here again? A coworker, a girl named Sandy, looked at Alex with a chuckle, trying not to seem too direct. Probably some weird order again. Decaf oatmeal latte or something else exotic. The woman didn't seem to pay any attention to their gazes, heading confidently towards the counter. Alex already prepared to make her visit as uncomfortable as possible, just to show that she was not particularly welcome here. "Good morning," she said quietly but with obvious dignity, tilting her head slightly as if greeting longtime acquaintances. Alex grimaced and, not bothering to smile, replied with strained politeness, "Well, what are we ordering?" The woman looked at him calmly, as if not noticing his unkind tone, and said softly, "Just black coffee, please." Alex raised his eyebrows, trying to hold back a disgruntled snort. "Black coffee? Plain," he said, looking at his coworker as if seeking confirmation in her gaze. "At least it's not mocha with vanilla syrup." Sandy grinned and added in a whisper, "Although, I wouldn't be surprised." The barista turned nonchalantly to the coffee machine, deliberately slow, as if to show that this elderly woman was his last concern for the day. Her gaze was still calm, but a slight shadow of disappointment flickered in her eyes. The woman watched the barista's slow movements patiently, as if she were used to this attitude, but every moment of his carelessness and disregard for his words seemed more and more revealing. When he finally slid her a cup of coffee with ostentatious indifference, she thanked him softly. "Thank you, young man," she said with dignity, nodding her head slightly. Alex answered her with a barely perceptible nod, without looking her in the eye, and said sharply, "You're welcome. I hope this simple coffee is okay," he said, not hiding a slight chuckle. The woman brought the cup to her lips calmly, without haste, but never took a sip, studying him with her gaze. "Sometimes the simple is the best," she replied calmly, but there was something more significant in her voice. Alex, sensing the hidden hardness in her words, raised an eyebrow mockingly and smirked. "Maybe, but what we have here is not for everyone." This time Sandy, who was standing nearby, tried to hide a smile, but didn't quite succeed. "I agree," she added quietly, addressing Alex as if the visitor wasn't even there. The woman lifted her head slightly, glancing at Sandy, then at Alex, and then calmly placed the cup back on the counter. "It's surprising, of course, to see such an attitude," she muttered evenly, showing no emotion. There was no irritation or resentment in her words, but she seemed to put something deeper into them. Alex felt irritation rising in him, as if his attempts to hurt and humiliate this woman met with some invisible wall. He leaned closer and, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper, added, "If you don't like the service, you can always leave. No one is going to keep you here." The woman looked directly into his eyes, as if she saw something more than contempt and dislike in them. There was a confidence in her gaze, a quiet strength that seemed to be starting to weigh on Alex more than he'd expected. Alex watched the woman, who was still standing calmly at the counter, not taking her attentive gaze away from him. That irritated him. Where does she get this confidence from? He thought, feeling his inner discomfort building. The stereotypes he learned from his surroundings and experience came back to him. Older black men were not the kind of people he thought he could argue with, much less stand so adamantly. Who is she, anyway, to look at me like that? He thought, tensing involuntarily. The woman showed no anger or fear, and that seemed defiant to Alex. Probably just a lonely pensioner looking for an excuse to whine or get a free coffee. He said to himself, trying to convince himself that he understood and that she was here for a reason. His gaze slid slowly over her, noting every detail, which he unconsciously interpreted with prejudice. Strange clothes, old-fashioned shawl, pale appearance, must have come from the street. Probably not many people loitering around here. She could at least dress more decently, he thought, though he realized that her clothes were appropriate for the time of year and her age. Alex clenched his teeth, as if trying to suppress his inner anger. He began to go over in his mind other unpleasant scenes from the past, any instances when black visitors had irritated or displeased him, and each such thought only increased his contempt for this woman. They're all the same, he thought, feeling the thought soothe him, justifying his behavior. Looks like she is waiting for something, he kept thinking, feeling a surge of irritation and fear. It seemed to him that if he didn't show his superiority now, it would be a victory for her, an old stranger who had no right to feel confident in his coffee shop. Leaning toward his colleague, Alex whispered, "Here they are, coming in here, thinking everyone knows them. They're always in trouble as soon as they enter the place." His colleague, catching his mood, nodded as if agreeing, but glancing at her visitor, she lowered her fervor a little. Unlike Alex, she felt a slight embarrassment, but Alex only hardened, feeding her discontent. Alex continued to hide his true feelings under a mask of professionalism, but his face gave everything away. He cast disgruntled glances at the older woman, and then, without waiting for her to speak again, he turned back to his colleagues and began quietly discussing her with Sandy and another barista named Mark. "Look at her," he began. "All she knows how to do is stand there like a statue and pretend she's important. I'm sure she's just here to make a fuss." He couldn't help but chuckle, and there was obvious contempt in his voice. "Well, I don't know. Maybe she just needs to eat something more nutritious than coffee," Sandy said with a slight smile, nodding toward the woman. Alex hummed, turning back to the coffee machine, but his eyes continued to glide over the woman. He enjoyed discussing her with his coworkers, as if it gave him confidence. There was a growing conviction inside him that people like her didn't understand anything about real coffee, and he was determined not to give her any reason to feel important. Mark, who had been sitting at the counter with a lazy expression, suddenly added fuel to the fire. "Yeah, there are some who don't even know how to order coffee," he said. "I know woman thinks she's getting special treatment here. Typical." Alex, turning back to them, noticed the woman throwing a displeased look at them. He felt his irritation growing. She should know her place. He continued in a whisper, "We're not in her guest house for her to be here teaching us how to make coffee." Sandy smiled, and Alex, encouraged by the general mood, leaned closer. "Look, let's do this. When she comes back, I'll serve her coffee in such a way that she herself feels that she's not welcome here. Let her know what real rudeness is." A woman, listening to their jokes and watching their laughter, felt her heart clench with humiliation. It wasn't just a rude attitude, but a whole bouquet of prejudice and disrespect that could be felt in the air. She began to realize that this barista was not just a random passerby, but the embodiment of many of the prejudices she had encountered in her life. Alex, not paying attention to her reaction, took hold of the coffee pot, preparing to pour another portion of coffee. But his heart was beating faster with excitement. The desire to humiliate this woman was ripening in his mind, and he was not going to stop there. With every moment spent in the coffee shop, the atmosphere became more and more strained. Standing at the counter, the older woman could feel the stares of everyone present, as if they were Alex's associates in his grudge game. She could see Sandy and Mark exchanging barbed glances and whispering softly, even as she tried to order her coffee. "It's surprising, of course, to see such an attitude," she muttered evenly, showing no emotion. There was no irritation or resentment in her words, but she seemed to put something deeper into them. Alex felt irritation rising in him, as if his attempts to hurt and humiliate this woman met with some invisible wall. He leaned closer and, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper, added, "If you don't like the service, you can always leave. No one is going to keep you here." The woman looked directly into his eyes, as if she saw something more than contempt and dislike in them. There was a confidence in her gaze, a quiet strength that seemed to be starting to weigh on Alex more than he'd expected. Alex watched the woman, who was still standing calmly at the counter, not taking her attentive gaze away from him. That irritated him. Where does she get this confidence from? He thought, feeling his inner discomfort building. The stereotypes he learned from his surroundings and experience came back to him. Older black men were not the kind of people he thought he could argue with, much less stand so adamantly. Who is she, anyway, to look at me like that? He thought, tensing involuntarily. The woman showed no anger or fear, and that seemed defiant to Alex. Probably just a lonely pensioner looking for an excuse to whine or get a free coffee. He said to himself, trying to convince himself that he understood and that she was here for a reason. His gaze slid slowly over her, noting every detail, which he unconsciously interpreted with prejudice. Strange clothes, old-fashioned shawl, pale appearance, must have come from the street. Probably not many people loitering around here. She could at least dress more decently, he thought, though he realized that her clothes were appropriate for the time of year and her age. Alex clenched his teeth, as if trying to suppress his inner anger. He began to go over in his mind other unpleasant scenes from the past, any instances when black visitors had irritated or displeased him, and each such thought only increased his contempt for this woman. They're all the same, he thought, feeling the thought soothe him, justifying his behavior. Looks like she is waiting for something, he kept thinking, feeling a surge of irritation and fear. It seemed to him that if he didn't show his superiority now, it would be a victory for an old stranger who had no right to feel confident in his coffee shop. Leaning toward his colleague, Alex whispered, "Here they are, coming in here, thinking everyone knows them. They're always in trouble as soon as they enter the place." His colleague, catching his mood, nodded as if agreeing, but glancing at her visitor, she lowered her fervor a little. Unlike Alex, she felt a slight embarrassment, but Alex only hardened, feeding her discontent. Alex continued to hide his true feelings under a mask of professionalism, but his face gave everything away. He cast disgruntled glances at the older woman, and then, without waiting for her to speak again, he turned back to his colleagues and began quietly discussing her with Sandy and another barista named Mark. "Look at her," he began. "All she knows how to do is stand there like a statue and pretend she's important. I'm sure she's just here to make a fuss." He couldn't help but chuckle, and there was obvious contempt in his voice. "Well, I don't know. Maybe she just needs to eat something more nutritious than coffee." Sandy said with a slight smile, nodding toward the woman. Alex hummed, turning back to the coffee machine, but his eyes continued to glide over the woman. He enjoyed discussing her with his coworkers, as if it gave him confidence. There was a growing conviction inside him that people like her didn't understand anything about real coffee, and he was determined not to give her any reason to feel important. Mark, who had been sitting at the counter with a lazy expression, suddenly added fuel to the fire. "Yeah, there are some who don't even know how to order coffee," he said. "I know woman thinks she's getting special treatment here." Typical. Alex, turning back to them, noticed the woman throwing a displeased look at them. He felt his irritation growing. She should know her place. He continued in a whisper, "We're not in her guest house for her to be here teaching us how to make coffee." Sandy smiled, and Alex, encouraged by the general mood, leaned closer. "Look, let's do this. When she comes back, I'll serve her coffee in such a way that she herself feels that she's not welcome here. Let her know what real rudeness is." A woman, listening to their jokes and watching their laughter, felt her heart clench with humiliation. It wasn't just a rude attitude, but a whole bouquet of prejudice and disrespect that could be felt in the air. She began to realize that this barista was not just a random passerby, but the embodiment of many of the prejudices she had encountered in her life. Alex, not paying attention to her reaction, took hold of the coffee pot, preparing to pour another portion of coffee. But his heart was beating faster with excitement. The desire to humiliate this woman was ripening in his mind, and he was not going to stop there. With every moment spent in the coffee shop, the atmosphere became more and more strained. Standing at the counter, the older woman could feel the stares of everyone present, as if they were Alex's associates in his grudge game. She could see Sandy and Mark exchanging barbed glances and whispering softly, even as she tried to order her coffee. As if they were all on the same team, comments and jokes echoed behind the older woman's back, and each new outburst from the baristas only added to the atmosphere of humiliation. She listened to this, clutching her cup in her hands, trying not to show how much she was hurt by these words. But in every chuckle, in every quiet whisper, she could feel how her existence was perceived as something insignificant. "She probably doesn't have a family since she's alone," Sandy pronounced with an innocent expression on her face, which caused another wave of laughter among the staff. Alex turned to his coworkers with a wink. "I hope she hasn't forgotten that we close in the evenings, so she doesn't get kicked out like a stray dog." A woman, feeling her heart prickle, looked at the barista, but there was more than misery in her gaze. In the back of her mind, a determination was maturing. She knew she had to show resilience in the face of this ignorance. Every derogatory word sounded like a challenge, and she wasn't going to let them insult her further, no matter how difficult it was. This coalition of prejudice that had sprung up in the coffee shop seemed to be flirting with her, turning her into an object of ridicule, and her patience was coming to an end. Alex stood behind the counter, his thoughts bubbling like coffee in a coffee machine. He could feel the anger gradually building up, his aggression growing into a desire to do something really humiliating. Why did she come here in the first place? He scrolled through his head, unable to understand how this old black woman could expect to be treated normally in his establishment. He looked at her sitting in her loneliness, and a sense of superiority grew in his mind. "She doesn't belong here," he thought. "This is my place, and she should know it. Let her feel that she has walked into the wrong place." The thought, like a smoldering coal, flared with every passing second, driving him into a state of rage and anticipation. "I'm going to make sure she remembers this visit for a long time." His mind raced, and he suddenly saw the image in front of him, her bewilderment as he poured coffee directly over her head. In his mind, that image was not just an action, it was an act of justice. Justice against anyone who dared to enter his space, violating his notions of order. Alex took a deep breath, and his palms clenched into fists. "She'll know that only those who deserve respect are respected," he thought, enjoying the sudden sense of power this brought. All the memories of how he had faced those who were older and dark-skinned flashed through his mind, and each time it was as if they were testing his boundaries. Now it was time to show who was in charge. "Who is she to force me to be polite?" He wondered, feeling his inner prejudices spurring him on. She chose this place for herself. She came here to get something she's not supposed to. He felt himself regaining control, reasserting time after time his right to decide who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. Yes, she remembered this moment. No one will make fun of me while I'm working here. This isn't just a cafe, this is my territory, and I'm not going to let any old brains occupy it, he thought angrily, raising his gaze to the woman, who seemed to be unaware of anything, motionless, waiting for her coffee. Every insult, every derogatory comment from his co-workers only fueled his resolve. He realized that his actions would not only humiliate her, but also cover everyone with the same layer of prejudice they so easily spread. He felt like he was protecting his place by doing so, and his anger took shape. Finally, he walked over to the coffee machine, filling a cup of coffee, and looked at the woman with a smirk, unabashed. At that moment he decided she would be the victim of his anger and resentment, and it would be a moment she would never forget. Alex, whose heart was pounding in unison with his decision, walked to the counter, holding a cup of coffee, and looked at the older woman with a defiant look. He knew this moment was the culmination of everything that had been happening to her during this horrible day. In his eyes, she was just a target for his anger, no different from those he had previously humiliated. "You don't mind completing your image a bit, do you?" he uttered, barely holding back a laugh as his voice filled with disdain. He lifted the cup, looking into her eyes that genuinely didn't understand what was about to happen. There was no fear or foreboding in their depths, only anticipation. In an instant, as if everything around him had slowed down, he tilted the cup sharply, and hot coffee rained down on the woman's head, spilling over her hair and face. It wasn't just humiliation, it was an act of cruelty that branded her forever. The coffee trickled down her shoulders, burning her skin and sending her into shock. She felt a wave of shame and humiliation come over her, and all her strength left her body. Laughing and turning back to his coworkers, Alex felt his schadenfreude growing. Now she'll definitely remember where she belongs, he shouted, satisfied with the result of his action. Every word resonated in her mind with a burning fire, and the laughter of the staff filled the coffee shop, as if they were witnessing a great spectacle. The woman frowned in place, her mind momentarily spinning. She couldn't believe what had happened, feeling the coffee slowly dripping down her face and clothes. Her cried, all those memories of working hard and getting respect seemed to crumble in an instant. She was vulnerable, and that humiliation made her feel old and insignificant. A hurricane of emotions erupted inside her, shock, anger, helplessness. She felt the ground slipping away from under her feet, and her only desire was to get away from this nightmare she had been given. Tears flashed in her eyes, but she didn't allow herself to cry. Instead, she stared at him, trying to comprehend how one man could stoop to such cruelty. Alex continued to laugh, and Sandy and Mark, picking up on his schadenfreude, giggled in unison. "Ah, what drama," Sandy commented, making no attempt to hide her mocking tone. At this moment, the atmosphere in the coffee shop was full of prejudice and hatred, and everyone in it saw this woman as an object of amusement. The woman, left alone in the midst of ridicule, felt her heart filled with bitterness and loneliness. She had not just been victimized, she had faced the cruelty of society in one humiliating act. With every passing second, the scene was etched into her memory, and no matter how hard she tried to justify herself, she knew it would be one of those tragedies that would never be forgotten. The scene that played out in the coffee shop was full of confusion. As soon as the coffee hit the elderly woman, the air was filled with silence, interrupted only by the giggles of the staff. The patrons sitting at the tables raised their heads from their phones and books, their eyes rounded with shock. Some exchanged glances, unable to believe that they had witnessed such blatant humiliation. A young woman with a child sitting nearby pressed her palm to her lips, her eyes widening with horror. She could barely bring herself to look away, but her inner sense of justice protested against what she was seeing. Next to her, an elderly man with a white beard, who seemed deeply moved by what was happening, stood up abruptly, about to approach the woman, but at that moment he was stopped by a young girl, whispering, "Don't interface, it's none of your business." Other visitors began to whisper, Some tried to pretend that nothing had happened, returning to their drinks. But this attempt to ignore what was happening only added to the atmosphere. One of the men, a black man sitting in the corner, clenched his fists, his face filled with anger. He looked at what was happening, but he didn't know how to act. "This is terrible," he muttered to himself, trying to calm the growing resentment inside. "Why are they silent? Why doesn't anyone intervene?" thought the woman sitting at the table next to this scene. She felt a sense of shame for not doing anything to help. Her inner voice screamed, but her body, as if paralyzed, could not move. Instead, she continued to watch the barista giggle as if it was just normal entertainment. Meanwhile, Alex was enjoying his power, looking at the confused woman who was ignored by everyone. He felt triumphant creating this scene, and this feeling of power was completely taking him over. Not only had he humiliated her, but he had become the center of attention for his colleagues. Every glance at him only increased his schadenfreude. "Look at the drama. Maybe she really has lost her mind," Sandy said, raising her voice to get attention. There was open hatred in her words, emphasizing that for them this woman was not just a victim, but an object for jokes and ridicule. Some of the other customers began to whisper, "Why would she even come here? She should know that old people don't belong in places like this." Such comments stabbed into the atmosphere like daggers, creating an even more depressing feeling. It was as if this woman, who had come for a cup of coffee, was guilty of being a victim herself. And yet, amidst the general crowd of indifference and derision, the eyes of some reflected shock. They realized that this was not just a humiliation, but a manifestation of the deep-rooted racism and prejudice that encompasses society. And while most were silent, their faces spoke of the mark this event would leave on their hearts. But fear of the possible repercussions prevented them from speaking out against the brutality that had taken place before their eyes. The woman, standing under the burden of humiliation and fear, felt her world crumbling, but in the back of her mind, there was a quiet but strong desire to change this injustice. She knew she had to find a way to speak out, but first she had to deal with what had happened and decide how to move on after this terrible moment. The woman stood in the center of the coffee shop, her mind in turmoil. The water from the coffee dripped slowly down her face, burning her skin. But that wasn't the most painful part. Far more painful was her emotions, lapping at her like a wave that came and took away her confidence and composure. Around her, the laughter of the barista and the whispers of the customers echoed, reminding her that she was the object of ridicule, the embodiment of stereotypes and prejudice. She slowly raised her hand to wipe the hot liquid from her face, but instead of relief, the movement only increased the feeling of humiliation. Thoughts raced through her mind. Why did this happen? How could I have been the victim of such cruel behavior? Her mind struggled with reality, and every moment she spent in the cafe became torture. Her heart was pounding, as if trying to burst out of her chest. She could feel her pride crumbling, as if all her accomplishments and experience, gathered over a long life, had been erased at once. "I didn't deserve this," she whispered to herself, realizing that no one had come to her rescue. This feeling of loneliness and abandonment came over her, and the tears that had been held back until now began to well up in her eyes. She looked at the people around her and saw shock in some of their eyes, indifference in others, sadness and anger mixed in her soul, turning into rage. How can they just stare? She thought, but realizing she couldn't change their reactions, she inwardly shrank back in pain. Her thoughts were filled with questions. Where's the humanity? Where is the compassion? Trying to collect herself, she inhaled deeply, but that air felt heavy and bitter. Every breath reminded her of her humiliation, and she felt tears welling up in her eyes. Not wanting to show her weakness, she turned away from the audience, hiding her face from the world that had betrayed her at the worst possible moment. The coffee continued to drip down her clothes, creating stains that seemed to symbolize what she had experienced. She felt an inner voice whisper that it wasn't just coffee, it was a metaphor for everything that had happened in her life. Every drop running down her clothes reminded her of the neglect and prejudice she'd encountered many times before. Despite all the pain she felt, a new feeling grew inside her determination. She knew that this humiliation would not define her as a person. It was only one moment in her life, and she must find the strength to rise from it. Her thoughts begin to clear. I won't let this bring me down. I deserve respect just like anyone else. Instilling that mantra into herself, she took a step back, trying to gather the last remnants of strength to leave this place with dignity. The woman knew that this event would leave a mark on her memory, but she also realized that she now had the opportunity to tell her story, to show that she was not alone, and that prejudice and racism have no place in today's society. The coffee house fell into silence, as if all sound had been swallowed up by an invisible force. The air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The staff, frowning in their seats, frowning in anticipation of the older woman's reaction. Alex, with a smirk on his face, watched her, believing that she would leave the place, embarrassed and depressed, like a disappointed guest who didn't wait for his order. However, something had changed in her eyes. She stood there, doused in coffee, but now with her head up, and it made an unexpected impression on those around her. The silence that reigned in the coffee shop exacerbated the tension, stiffening the atmosphere where everyone present felt part of this tragedy. The visitors exchanged glances of uncertainty. Some tried to look away, not wanting to be involved in this situation, but others had a look of concern on their faces. They were aware that what was happening violated all norms of public behavior, and everyone, including themselves, had witnessed an act of gross racism. Alex, still confident of his impunity, expected her departure to be the final act of the play. He whispered to his colleagues, "She's not going to stay, is she?" But his words didn't elicit any reaction, because everyone was busy watching the woman. The woman, feeling the attention focused on her, took a deep breath. A fire flared inside her that filled her heart with determination. She wasn't going to leave without letting anyone know that such humiliation could break her spirit. Instead, she turned to the barista, looking directly into his eyes full of contempt. "Do you think this is normal?" she asked. Her voice, though quiet, sounded like thunder amidst the silence. Everyone in the coffee shop frowned, and the tension that had been building became almost palpable. She continued, "You think you can humiliate me just because I look different or older?" Alex, not expecting such a turn of events, felt his confidence beginning to dissipate. "I was just kidding," he muttered, but his words sounded unconvincing, as if he was beginning to realize the depth of his cruelty. Some of the visitors began to whisper among themselves, and mixed feelings were in the air: fear, surprise, and admiration. People began to realize that what stood before them was not just an old woman, but a person with willpower and the right to be heard. She was not going to leave this place without saying how she felt, and it was a moment of awakening for everyone present. "You may not understand what it means to be like me, and you don't understand that everyone has the right to respect, no matter their skin color or age," she continued, her voice growing more and more confident. This confidence and calmness coming from her began to dispose the other people around her. The tension that had enveloped the coffee shop slowly began to dissolve into thin air. Now the entire coffee shop was witnessing not just humiliation, but a real struggle for respect and dignity. And although Alex and his colleagues had hoped that the woman would simply leave, she instead decided to become a voice for all those who had ever experienced such an insult. At that moment, everyone in the coffee shop realized that the situation had gone too far, and no one could stay away. The woman stood in the center of the coffee shop, her heart pounding with excitement, but she could feel the confidence building inside her. Every word she spoke gave her strength, and in that moment, she knew she had to step forward and reveal her true identity. "I'm not just a random guest who came in for coffee. I'm the new owner of this coffee shop," she said, her voice firm and clear. The phrase hung in the air like a thunderclap. Shock and disbelief were reflected on the faces of the staff and customers. Alex, who until that moment had felt like the king of this situation, now stood there, unable to utter a single word. His confidence collapsed like a house of cards, and his face reflected not only confusion but also fear. There were whispers all around, and the visitors finally began to realize the gravity of the situation. Some of them exchanged glances full of surprise. The woman continued, "I invested in this business because I believe in its potential, but I also believe in respect and equality for everyone who comes here. And what happened today was unacceptable. Her words sounded like a gunshot, breaking the silence. She glared at the barista, who clenched his hands, trying to avoid her gaze. There was a realization in his eyes that he had crossed the line, and now his actions could have serious consequences. I came here to support this business and create a friendly atmosphere where everyone would feel welcome and respected. But your actions have shown how deeply rooted the biases are in our society, she continued, her voice growing more confident. Hearing her words, some of the visitors began to get up from their seats, and in the eyes of some you could see support. It was a moment of awakening for all who had witnessed this humiliation. I don't want this coffee shop to be associated with humiliation and hate. I want it to be a place where people can come together, enjoy good coffee, and support each other, she finished, her words filling the space with hope for change. At that moment, applause erupted in the coffee shop. Visitors who had been confused before began to realize that they had witnessed something important. This woman had not only defended herself, but had started a movement for respect and justice in this small community. Alex, seeing how the situation was out of his control, tried to justify himself. I didn't know who you were. It was a mistake. But his words sounded empty and unconvincing. He had lost the right to make excuses, and now his actions were exposed in front of everyone. The woman looked at him and felt a sense of relief brewing in her soul. She was no longer just a victim of humiliation. She had become a symbol of strength, resilience, and hope. In that moment, she realized that her story was not only her own story, but the story of everyone who had ever faced bias and cruelty. Alex stood, unable to take his eyes off the woman who had just exposed his true face, just as he himself was trying to hide his prejudices behind a mask of confidence. With every minute he spent in this silence, his mind drifted deeper and deeper into the abyss of realization. He began to realize that something far more serious than just a few harsh words might be behind his actions. What have I done? Rushed through his mind. At that moment, he felt a cold sweat run down his back. He'd always thought of himself as a simple barista working in a coffee shop, but now he realized that his behavior hadn't just left an unpleasant mark on this woman's memory, it had jeopardized his career, his reputation, and perhaps even his freedom. His mind replayed the times he had allowed himself to make prejudiced jokes about clients, and he realized that today he had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. All those conversations with coworkers when they made fun of customers were now stabbing rebukes at him. He remembered how, as he watched the woman, he had begun to form a portrait of her in his mind, an old lady who didn't deserve respect just because of her age and skin color. And now she stood before him, as if pointing out all his mistakes. I could have lost my job. The thought of the consequences of his action pierced him like lightning. Every one of the customers could see now that he was not just an ordinary barista, but a man who had done something terrible. The corners of his mouth dropped, and he noticed one of the regulars shift in his seat, as if he'd already made up his mind to tell the manager what was happening. Alex felt uneasy. He could feel the fear building in his chest, making his breathing quicken. He tried to focus, but everything was blurring around him. Dark thoughts of what would happen if this woman decided to sue him, which would undermine not only his career, but his life. Tell me I won't lose my job, his inner voice shouted, but there was no response. The woman kept talking, her voice full of strength and determination. But Alex wasn't listening. He was lost in his thoughts, unable to concentrate on her words about the changes she wanted to bring to the coffee house. Suddenly he felt a sense of shame come over him. Had he become like his predecessors, who refused to see people for what they were? Had he spent his years nurturing a hatred that was now a thing of the past? In the midst of all this chaos, fear was putting tremendous pressure on him. Alex was already imagining how his life would be turned upside down. What will my friends say when they find out? How will I be able to explain to my family why I lost my job? Each question was like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He didn't know how to get back to normal after what had happened. Meanwhile, the woman, full of determination, continued to share her thoughts on how she wanted to change the coffee shop, creating a comfortable place for everyone. She talked about the need for understanding and love, the importance of valuing diversity and respecting everyone. Tears glistened in her eyes, but they were tears not only of pain, but also of hope. Alex began to notice how the attention of others gradually shifted from him to the woman. Her flow of words grew, and people began to react. Some nodded in agreement, others whispered, discussing her ideas. It was new, fresh, and he could feel his own importance, his voice and place in the world beginning to be lost. Then he suddenly realized he hadn't just lost control of the situation. He'd also lost something far more valuable, his humanity. This realization came as a blow, and he couldn't afford to hide behind a shell of prejudice. He realized that he had to take responsibility for his actions. Perhaps this was the time he should take a step toward making things right. Even if it was scary, it became clear to Alex that he had to do something. He knew he had to admit his mistake and ask for forgiveness. Maybe that would not only help him heal, but also help others realize that change starts with each of us. With every minute he spent in that coffee shop, he realized more and more that what he had done wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal of humanity, and he didn't want to be a part of it anymore. There was an atmosphere of uncertainty and tension inside the coffee shop, and now it was not only Alex who realized what had happened. His colleagues, standing in the shadows behind the counter, also began to realize the seriousness of the situation, which they had taken too lightly before. Micah, the barista working next to Alex, was one of the people who supported him in his prejudice jokes. She looked at the woman standing in the center of the coffee shop, and her heart clenched with shame. Horror and bitterness swept over her as she realized that she, too, may have contributed to this humiliation. She remembered how she had laughed with Alex when they discussed customers, how she had allowed herself to make remarks about appearance and manners. Now, looking at the older woman, Micah felt that every laugh and joke that had once seemed harmless was now part of this horrible picture. "I can't believe this happened," she whispered, turning to her co-worker Lisa, who was standing nearby. Lisa, pale with shock, nodded, unable to take her eyes off the woman. "We have to do something," she uttered, realizing that this wasn't just Alex and the woman's case. It was the business of each of them. The other staff members also began to realize that what they had thought was the norm to be prejudiced and unkind was now a cause of pain for the individual. They exchanged glances full of doubt and regret, as if they each had a burden they could no longer ignore. Suddenly Jason, another barista who usually joined in the jokes and sarcasm, stood up. His face, usually filled with nonchalance, was now serious. He felt that if it didn't intervene, he would become part of the problem. "Look, I realize we could all treat our customers better, but what happened was beyond anything," he said, turning to his colleagues. Alex looked at him, and there was consternation in his eyes. He hadn't expected anyone from his team to start talking about what he had done. He could feel the tension building inside him as he realized that his colleagues were beginning to question his behavior. He couldn't believe that his actions were leading to this outcome. "Yeah, I feel terrible too," Micah continued, her voice shaking with emotion. "We all know how important it is for us to be kind and respectful. This woman came here to get coffee, and we hurt her instead." Jason nodded, his eyes sparkling with determination. "We need to apologize, not just to her, but to ourselves. We all allowed this situation to happen, and it's time to right the wrongs." Other co-workers began whispering among themselves, and some of them stood to the side to assess the situation and determine what they could do to help. You could see remorse on the faces of some, while others began to show confusion and fear. They all realized that although Alex was at the forefront of this tragedy, they too had a part in it. Alex, who until the moment had been trying to convince himself that he was right, suddenly felt his support starting to fade. His colleagues began to realize their share of responsibility, and this thought depressed him even more. It became clear to him that he was not alone now, and that was not in his favor. The woman standing in the center of the coffee shop kept talking about her ideas, about how she wanted to create a place of respect. And in that moment, her words became a call to action for everyone there. Everyone in the coffee shop began to realize that racism and prejudice are not just personal traits, but behaviors that can destroy an entire culture. The moment one of the coworkers, named Kim, decided to step forward, looking at the woman with genuine remorse. The others finally realized that they could be part of the solution, not the problem. I want to apologize. I saw what was happening and I kept quiet. I don't want it to happen again, she said, her voice trembling, but there was sincerity in it. The woman didn't seem to have expected this turn of events. Her face lit up with hope, and warmth sparkled in her eyes. She saw that change was starting here, in this coffee shop, and that maybe these people had a chance to change. Alex, being on the edge, felt his own realization starting to press in on him, and he realized that this was his last chance. I'm sorry too. I never thought it would have this effect, he said, turning to the woman, and his voice sounded unsure but sincere. And at that moment, as one consciousness after another began to awaken, voices full of hope for change rang out in the coffee house. The people standing around began to realize that each one of them was responsible for the atmosphere in which they lived. Real change began from that moment with acceptance and understanding that everyone deserves respect, regardless of appearance or age. When the woman finally took her eyes off her colleagues, she turned her attention to Alex and the rest of the staff, who were standing in a half-awake state. Immersed in confusion, her eyes met his, and at that moment, their gazes were a collision of two worlds: the world of prejudice and humiliation on one side, and the world of strength and dignity on the other. Even though her heart was still pounding with shock, she could feel the confidence building inside her. She wasn't going to let the humiliation she had endured determine her future actions. The woman lifted her chin. Her straight back and proud expression spoke of her strength, even as her emotions raged within her. You all witnessed how I was humiliated, but I'm not here for revenge, she said, her voice full of confidence and firmness. She looked around at the rest of the team, and at that moment her eyes stopped on Alex, who couldn't seem to decide where to look. His eyes darted from her to the floor, as if he was looking for an escape from his own actions. I want you to understand that regardless of our skin color or age, we are all equal, she continued, her words sounding like a challenge. I came here with the hope that this business would be a place where everyone would feel comfortable and safe. But what happened today showed how deeply rooted bias and racism is in our society. Some of the staff began to lower their eyes. Feeling shame overwhelmed them. They realized that their silence and indifference had become part of the problem. The woman was not going to condemn them, but she knew she had to convey the importance of change. I hope you can learn something from this situation, she said, her voice softer but still full of determination. We can create something beautiful if we work together and respect each other. She turned to everyone, her eyes sparkling as she looked at her new employees. I'm not going to dismiss any of you. I believe in the opportunities we have. We can become a team that will inspire each other and make our business better for everyone, she said, her words becoming a light in a dark tunnel. At that moment, Alex, feeling the growing shame and insecurity, finally managed to look up. He saw in her eyes not anger, but a desire to change the situation for the better. There was no anger in her, only resilience and determination, which made him feel that he had not only lost his position, but also the possibility to be part of something bigger. The woman continued, if you want to be a part of this, we have to learn together to respect and value diversity. It's not just about being nice to customers, it's about being nice to each other. Several staff members began to nod, and even those who were initially opposed began to realize that this conversation was important not only for the woman, but for themselves. They realized that racism and bias are not just problems that can be ignored. They are phenomena that can destroy not only businesses, but entire communities. Alex, feeling the desire to change his behavior awakening inside him, finally dared to say, I want to work on myself and be part of this change. I don't want to be the kind of person who puts stereotypes above human dignity. His voice sounded unsure, but it was sincere, and there was remorse in his eyes. The woman felt a warmth in her heart as she saw others begin to open up. She knew that change would not happen overnight, but every small movement in the right direction was a step towards creating an environment of respect and understanding. I want us to start by having an honest conversation about how we can work together, she said as she looked around the entire team. I'm here to support you, and you're here to support me. Let's make this a place where people come not just for coffee, but for kindness, respect, and understanding. It was the moment when the employees realized that they had the opportunity to change not only the coffee shop, but also themselves. At that moment, the coffee shop became something more. It became a place where change began, where everyone mattered, and where respect came first. The woman, standing in front of the anxious staff, realized that their future now depended on her decision. Her confident voice became calm but firm. I came here not only as the new owner, but as someone who wants to create a safe space for everyone. She began, her eyes piercing each employee. Tension hung in the room. Some began to feel a chill of fear. What happened today is not just a mistake. It's a symptom of a deeper problem that we must solve together. Alex, standing back, felt his heart pounding. He knew that his actions were unacceptable and realized that the consequences would be severe. The other colleagues exchanged concerned glances, realizing that they could have been in a similar situation. I can't just ignore this incident, the woman continued, addressing the team. Each of you must take responsibility for your actions. I understand that we may have biases, but that is no excuse for hurting others. She paused to let her words echo in everyone's minds. I've made a decision that may be difficult for you. Alex, you're going to get diversity and bias training and a bunch of opportunities to work on yourself, she said, her voice sounding determined. Alex turned pale, and horror was reflected in his eyes. He knew that this training could be the beginning of his journey to change, but he also realized that it would be a test of his character. Others of you will also be going through a training program to realize how important it is to show respect and kindness to every customer, she added, her eyes throwing sparks of determination. We will have mandatory meetings where we will discuss how we can work together to create a safe and welcoming environment for everyone. The staff stood in mute awe, realizing that they now had the opportunity to change their habits and biases, but also simultaneously feeling the pressure of being held accountable for their actions. Every word the woman said reflected the seriousness of the situation, and they knew that this was no longer just a job, it was now an opportunity to change their lives. I believe we can be better, she said, and there was hope in her voice, but it's up to each of you. I hope you'll accept this as a chance to grow, not a punishment. The woman took a step back, letting everyone digest her words. Tension still hung in the air, but in the tension there was a spark of hope for change. From that moment on, their paths diverged. Some could choose to leave their preconceptions in the past and become part of a new beginning, while others would remain in the shadow of their fears. The incident that took place in the coffee shop left a deep imprint on the hearts and minds of all involved. The woman, who was the victim of bias, not only experienced humiliation, but also triggered an important rethinking process among her new employees. They were all now forced to face the consequences of their actions and words. Days passed and the coffee shop continued to operate, but the atmosphere changed. The staff began to realize that their daily habits and biases could have devastating consequences. They could no longer just ignore what had happened as if nothing had happened. Every interaction with clients became a reminder of how important it is to show respect and kindness. Alex, while undergoing diversity and bias training, began to realize the depth of his mistakes. He often thought back to the moment when he poured coffee on the woman and felt ashamed. His thoughts were filled with questions about how his behavior might have affected others. Why had he allowed himself to succumb to preconceived judgments? How could he have so easily forgotten his human dignity? Every day he looked at his colleagues and realized that their actions were also part of a stereotype system. They began to openly discuss their fears and biases, realizing that they each had their own shortcomings and biases that they needed to overcome. The entire staff, including Micah and Jason, began to engage in discussions about how they could change their environment so that no one would feel humiliated. The customers noticed the changes too. The smiles of the staff became genuine, and their friendliness became part of the coffeehouse culture. People came not only for the coffee, but also for the atmosphere of respect and acceptance. The staff began to actively listen to how and what customers were talking about, and strive to make everyone who crossed the threshold feel welcome. The woman, despite her experiences, became a symbol of change. She often came to the coffee shop and interacted with the staff, sharing her thoughts on the importance of equality. Each time she entered, the staff greeted her with warmth and respect, realizing that each step they took towards kindness was a step towards a better future. One day, during a meeting, Alex opened his eyes to how much prejudice can be destructive. "I realized that racism isn't just words, it's actions," he said, his voice sounding sincere and determined. "We can be a source of inspiration, or we can be a source of pain. I want us to be an inspiration to everyone who comes here." In this way, the incident was not just a moment of shame, but a catalyst for change that began to shape a new culture at the coffee shop. Each of the employees realized that respect and equality were not just words, but the basis for building a more welcoming and safe environment for all. They began to think about their actions and words, about the importance of supporting each other and being attentive to the needs of others. Every step, every gesture, every word now mattered, and they became real guardians of respect and kindness in their coffee shop. The incident that took place in the coffee shop left an indelible mark not only on the woman's life, but also on the minds of all who witnessed the humiliation. Every minute, every conversation, and every smile became part of a deeper lesson about the importance of respect and equality. The staff realized that their biases and stereotypes could cause great pain to others, and they were now willing to learn and change. Over the years, the coffee house became a place where people not only enjoyed coffee, but also discussed important issues concerning society and relations between people. The new owner initiated regular trainings and open discussions where everyone could share their thoughts and experiences. These meetings became real platforms for growth, where employees learned to be more empathetic and attentive to others. Alex and his colleagues began to realize that biases don't just come out of nowhere. They are fed by our experiences, upbringing, and environment, but it is up to them to respond to these attitudes. Each of them realized that having privilege, they must use it to advocate for those who face bias and discrimination. A woman who had been a victim of humiliation was now an inspiration to all. Her resilience and willingness to forgive and teach others about the importance of respect and dignity helped overcome the fear and shame that reigned in the coffee shop. Every time she came in, the staff was reminded of her promise to be better, to learn from her mistakes, and to show kindness. The final conclusions of this story were clear for all to see. Bias and racism are not just words, they are actions that can destroy lives. Everyone, regardless of their skin color, age, or appearance, deserves respect and dignity. The coffee shop was now not only brewing coffee, but brewing something much more valuable: understanding and unity. In the end, the lesson learned by everyone involved in this story was that respect is not just an obligation, it is the foundation of human relationships. Each of them became part of the change that needs to take place in society. They realized that even one simple action, such as a friendly smile or a polite gesture, can change someone's life. Thus, a story that began with humiliation and fear ended on a note of hope and change. It was a lesson in the importance of remaining human, listening and learning from each other, and how profound change can begin with one simple moment of awareness. The coffee shop was now a place where people not only drank coffee, but also built bridges that connected hearts. And it was a true success for everyone. We love to hear what you think of this story in the comments. What do you think about what happened? Have you had similar incidents of racism in your life? Your stories are important to us, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like to support us. Every comment and interaction you make helps us grow and create even more content that matters. Thank you for being with us, and we wish you a good day.